I am a former police sergeant, and, I'll admit it, I've seen a few things that have disturbed me, but nothing like this. Out of respect for the dead, I won't provide any names or actual locations, but I need to tell this story sooner rather than later. I've just got to get it all off my chest. The family, a family of 5, was last seen attending their kid's soccer game. They seemed to be in good spirits, laughing, talking, and making plans to go out with friends. Nothing was amiss. Their kid played wonderfully out on the field. Once the game was finished, they got into their SUV and drove straight home. These are all known facts, but what transpired afterwards is very, very hard to say. We may probably never know what exactly happened that night. Perhaps I don't even want to. The next day, the kids did not show up to school following the soccer game. The entire day went by without a single phone call from their parents. An unexplained absence. This was rare, coming from the family. The parents did not show up to work either. Their positions remained unfilled for the day. No phone call to explain sickness or a family emergency was given. No one had heard from or seen the family at all. The coming evening, still with no word from the family, a neighbor and close friend of theirs went to check on them. The house was some distance from its neighbors, only just within shouting distance. Upon approach, the neighbor noted that their car was parked in the driveway. Still no sign of the family. The washing hadn't been hung up. Most, if not all, the curtains were drawn. It was dead quiet, too. Not a sound to be heard. Not even any birdsong. He said that he felt like eyes were on the back of his neck, but he tried not to let it get to him. The neighbor, upon trying the front door and finding it locked, procured the home key from beneath a nearby rock. He said that, upon entry to the residence, he immediately started to suspect that something was truly wrong. The place felt cold. He described the household as looking suspiciously dark. The neighbor called out for his friends. To no response. He was just about to give in and leave when he saw something black splattered on the floor down the hall from him. Now very worried, the neighbor approached it. He explained that, upon getting closer, an overwhelmingly strong coppery smell filled his lungs. He quickened his pace, fearing the worst, and found himself standing in the dining room doorway. There sat the family. The neighbor was inconsolable for the next several hours. I remember trying to speak to him, but he was almost completely unresponsive. Wouldn't even look me in the eye. While paramedics took care of him, another officer and I entered the house. It was a long walk down that hallway. I recognized the coppery smell well enough. You know, it can fill you with all sorts of dread, knowing you're about to see something which you'll never forget. I entered the dining room. The scene was an absolute crimson horror show. The family, all 5 of them, were sitting around their dining room table. Their corpses had been propped up in their seats, their stiff fingers wrapped rigidly around their cutlery. The food, stone cold, was set out and all ready to eat. They'd been prepped to look that way, like some sick puppet show. Each family member was turned towards the doorway, facing whoever entered expectantly. I don't know how the killer knew we'd come through that doorway so that they could prop the family up to face the right direction. But they did. At least, I think they did. Their heads were what got me, because, you see, their heads were gone. Sort of. Essentially, I could see their tongue and the bottom row of teeth, but the rest of the head upwards was simply gone. Lobbed off. A very clean cut, by the looks of things. But, somehow, it didn't look like a surgical tool was the weapon used. Strangely, it looked even cleaner than that. The blood was simply everywhere. The corpses were covered in it. The floor was covered in it. The table was covered in it. Practically every surface in that room was colored a blackish scarlet. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of fighting. Nothing was broken or out of place. There were no bruises on the family, no physical signs of fighting back against their attacker. We couldn't even find any evidence, apart from the murders, that anyone else had even been there. But of course, Something must have been. The crime scene investigation was tricky. There was so much blood. You see, that we had to be very cautious about where we stepped. Several officers simply couldn't stay in the room with the bodies. It was too gruesome for them. Many were outside, gagging and vomiting. I only overlooked the scene from a doorway. I don't even know how I managed to stomach it all. Maybe I was just in too much shock. But even the crime scene investigators were struggling. I could see the photographer's hands shaking as he took picture after picture of the family's corpses. Many times, one of us would stand back, needing to take a moment. Then, after some labored breathing, we'd leap back into it again. I watched over that entire investigation, just turning the facts over in my head. Even after the bodies had been removed, I just stared at all that blood. It wasn't adding up. The precision of those cuts, the lack of signs of fighting back, the insane amounts of blood spilled, the family facing the right doorway, like their corpses could hear us coming and were waiting expectantly. And now and then, the hair on the back of my neck would prickle. Every 10 to 15 minutes, I'd suddenly get this sense, a primitive sense, that something was staring at the back of my neck. But whenever I turned around, there was no one there. Although, strangely, I constantly found myself looking at a window whenever I turned around to confront that sense of being watched. An empty window, certainly, but always a window. It was a relief to finally drive away from that house, halfway back towards the station. However, the true grisliness of the situation struck me. The power of shock was finally wearing off. I pulled over onto the side of the road, walked into the bushes, and after a few seconds, let out my lunch. Then I simply got back in my car and kept driving to the station as if nothing had happened. The family didn't seem to have a lot of enemies. A couple of difficulties they were dealing with, sure, but we all had some. The kids were doing well at school. The parents were happy and quite financially secure. If anything, they were on the way up. Motive-wise, it made no sense. The best we could find was some strange comments made in the final days of the family's lives. More than once, the father had openly complained about the electronics failing to work on the property. His bedside lamp kept switching on and off, almost on a rhythmic beat. One time, while he'd just driven onto the property coming back from work, his radio started going completely haywire, even when he turned it off. He said he could swear he heard voices very vaguely playing over the speakers. Strange, garbled voices speaking utter nonsense. The children had complained about constantly feeling watched. They said it was like a prickly feeling, an electric sensation that sort of flicked up the nape. There was never anything there, but they kept complaining about it to their teachers and friends. The mother, who'd sported quite a late 90 seconds hairstyle, mentioned it happening to her once or twice, too. And these last couple of things really caught my interest. They kept finding the front door open. They'd ensure it was locked and bolted, and some 15 minutes later, it would be wide open again. No one knew what to think about it, other than that someone in the family was playing a practical joke of some kind. The mother made a point of checking the house for intruders, but there was no one else there, other than the family. Then, finally, objects would start getting misplaced. The kids kept coming to school without some of their books, and more than once the father couldn't find his glasses, which he was blind as a bat without. They'd always find them in the end, but they expressed a good deal of irritation over the same thing constantly happening. This may not sound like anything to you, but the fact that this happened so much deeply intrigued me. Then, the official autopsy report came out, and honestly, I just had more questions. Questions that have never been answered to my disappointment. The bodies, the coroner noted, were completely pale as a sheet. Now, at first, that'd make sense to you, right? After all, the larger upper section of their heads was missing. But then they did a couple of tests and found that the bodies were completely emptied of blood. Not a single drop in any of their veins. And this simply made no sense. It seemed as if the brain, being completely separated from the body, didn't stop the heart from ticking. As if the heart had simply kept on pumping, gushing the blood out of the family's missing section of the head, until they were utterly bled dry. The coroner, in the end, couldn't rule the murders as death by decapitation. The official verdict was death by exsanguination. It was astounding. We went the extra mile with that investigation. But despite digging up as much dirt as we could within our jurisdiction, we essentially found nothing. I spent many sleepless nights over that. I also drank more coffee over the case than I'd ever care to mention. And we never found the upper sections of their heads. They were simply gone, vanished. Since then, no new revelations ever came to light. No one was ever suspected. The neighbor went through some serious therapy, but last I've heard, his life was never the same. He suffers from depression now, the really bad kind, the kind you don't come back from, and I haven't felt a lot better. Every night, as I lay there, trying to fall asleep, my dreams will be plagued with disturbing imagery. It's largely of the family, those missing sections of their heads, the blood, those hands wrapped around the cutlery. I can never get it out of my head. It comes to me, monotonously, constantly, in those dreams. The family is alive, trying to eat their food without their mouths. It's disgusting, as their blood pumps out and soaks through their food. But I can never look away from it. Then, finally, we come up to date. I'm only telling this story for one reason. It started recently. I wasn't sure what to think of it. At first, I hardly even paid it any mind. But then it kept happening and happening. But a little while ago, my TV started acting up. I'd be watching a channel, and little blips of static would crackle all over the screen. I'd unplug the TV, manually reset it, and everything, but no dice, still crackling. Then, a little while ago, I noticed something was going on with my shed. My shed sits some distance away from the house, and has a gap between the top of the double doors and the peak of its roof. Through that gap, you can see whether the light is on or off, and now and then, I'd look through the window, and the light would be switching on and off, but whenever I would go to check on it, the light was suddenly not doing it anymore. I just reckoned it was rats or something, so I set down some traps. But then I started to get that feeling, the feeling of being watched. It started slowly, now and then, but it was a definitive sensation. I'd just be going about my day, and suddenly, my skin would crawl. I'd feel that sensation, that slight, vague sensation that someone was staring right at me. Didn't matter where I was, in the store, on the street, fixing a post, drinking some coffee. I'd just get that feeling, but whenever I'd turn around, nothing there. But then, and this is where I started to suspect something was wrong, I started to find the front door wide open. Just now and then, I'd walk past the entryway, and there it would be, open, letting in the cold breeze. I'd close it, but then 10 minutes later, my wife would remark while walking past me, "You left the front door open again." At last, there was the misplacing of the objects, the TV remote, a cup of coffee, a book I was reading, my wife's hairbrush, or the shampoo bottle. Suddenly, we'd just find them sitting somewhere else. Neither of us would fess up to moving it, because, frankly, we were quite sure we didn't. I remember the most distinctive time, though, was when I was texting my friend. We were making plans to go out to this new restaurant in town, and I was asking him if he wanted to bring his son along. I set down the phone and finished the last bite of my eggs and bacon, and some 5 seconds later, my phone pinged. But it didn't ping beside me. Instead, the ping emitted from across the room. I looked up, and there was my phone, now sitting on the other side of the room, at the kitchen counter, no longer beside me. My wife wasn't home, yet, somehow, My phone was now sitting across the room. 5 seconds later, I was extremely wary for the rest of the day. Thankfully, nothing else happened. I told my wife, but she just laughed it off and told me I was being paranoid. But when I noted the similarities between the case of the family I investigated when I was still on the force, she didn't have any strong rebuttal. She just told me not to think about it too much, and that I was probably working myself up. Then, finally, there was the event that just transpired last night. I needed a glass of water, and so did my wife. So I went down to the kitchen to get us each a drink. I entered the room, feeling around blindly in the darkness for the light switch, successfully locating it. I illuminated the room. I turned around, glass in hand, and nearly dropped the fucking thing on my foot. I almost yelled out, my heart rapidly picking up the mannerisms of a jackhammer. My fingers gripped the kitchen counter as I slowly processed what I was seeing. Across from me, on the other side of the room, was a large window that sits over my kitchen sink, and there, staring right at where I stood as if they knew exactly where I was going to be, were 5 heads, or to be clearer, the upper sections of 5 heads. They led down to the top lip, but the rest of the head downwards was gone. I slowly felt dawning recognition. There was a man's head, a woman's, and 3 children's, just like, and then I saw the glasses the man was wearing. The glasses, he was blind, as a bat without. I saw the woman's distinctive black hair, done up in a late 90s fashion. I saw the faces of the children, faces I knew all too well. These, lined up in a row on the windowsill outside my house, were the upper sections of the family's heads. The missing sections, gone for all those years, rotted, decomposed, gray and black and grotesquely mummified. Jesus, I wanted to vomit. I started for the back door, not even thinking. I stumbled outside, walking around the corner of my house, expecting to see the heads all lined up. But in the very short period that it took to walk out of my kitchen, through the laundry room, out the back door, and around the side of my house, the heads were now all gone. No residue was even left on the windowsill. I looked around, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But I stood alone in the darkness, alone, bewildered, but most importantly, I was horrified. What did this mean? What was going to happen to me, to my wife? Something struck me this morning, the timing of it all. I did some digging around in some records and took a trip down memory lane. It took some poking around in connections through old friends, but I finally found what I was looking for. And what do you know? Today is the 5th fucking anniversary of their deaths, and I think it's also going to be the day of my own.